Hello, and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a range of different mediums, books, movies, games, you name it. Our only rule is that we can only discuss these things in terms of the writing. Anything like art, acting, or mechanics is off limits unless it relates directly to how the story is being told. I'm Daniel Radford, author, leech, and also your host. And tonight I'm joined, as I so often am, by John Kernan as we begin our cycle on vampires.
You can just call me the Count of Camembert. Nailed it.
So, vampires of varying varieties have existed in mythology for centuries upon centuries, with vampiric creatures of some sort appearing in just about every culture around the world, to be completely honest. There's, the dark, bloated, original European vampires, the Striga and Strigoi out of Albania and Romania, also Europe. Then, you've got the sort of shifty-eyed Obayifo of the Ashanti, the hag-like Lugaru from the Caribbean, the Burbalong out of the Philippines, as a couple of examples. And actually, for some reason, there's a lot of vampiric creatures and borderline vampiric creatures in, Filipino folktales. I don't know why.
Wherever there are people with blood, they will mythologize blood-sucking monsters.
Yeah, exactly.
Turns out we all have blood, so
vampires
get a lot of play.
Yeah, and we all know that without it, you die. And I guess that just leads to a lot of scary folktales. And of course, then there's the more modern idea of the haunting, pallid, which I've accidentally written as played in my notes, and strangely alluring vampires of more modern stories. Probably taking some influence from succubi and incubi, which are of course also vampiric creatures from mythology.
Yeah, I read it a little while ago, and I'm annoyed because now I can't remember, but I think the first incarnation of the known incarnation of quote unquote sexy vampires, I think was I can't remember what the story was called, but I think it was either 80 or maybe even over 100 years before Dracula.
Yeah,
as famous as Dracula is.
Yeah, I mean we'd like to think of Dracula as kind of the OG vampire character, at least modern vampire character, modern being in quotation marks. And he's certainly become that quintessential vampire character, a million different incarnations in everything from Bram Stoker's original work to Castlevania to Blade. I think he even pops up in Buffy at one point. But he's predated by Carmilla from 1872, and from even earlier in The Vampire with a Y. By John Polidori, which was in 1819, and they both sort of were pioneering books in this sort of modern vampire genre. There's also a lot of other penny dreadfuls and stuff, there's Varney the Vampire, which also predates Dracula, and a couple of others. And Bram Stoker, a plane is flying over my house, wonderful timing. And yeah, Bram Stoker was actually quite heavily inspired by all these sort of predecessors, borrowing from a combination of their sort of the tropes and things that they originated, actual folk tales, and also, of course, everyone knows that good old Vlad the Impaler was also an inspiration.
Yeah, Mr. Vladimir Tepes.
And actually, I think the way it happened was that as a lot of the Vlad the Impaler stuff came in, he actually pulled back on a lot of the more folkloric things. Although a lot of it does remain, the original Dracula is not a sexy gothic, alluring guy. That was not the best way I could have put that, but you get the gist. He was squat and ugly and had hairy hands.
He was just he was very charismatic though. Very, very noble, well-spoken, and intelligent. And if it came down to it, they did make it clear he does have a really powerful glamour. He just doesn't use it other than in a pretty extreme situation, because between his influence and his charisma, dude can just generally talk his way to what he wants.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's interesting that you can still see the little hints of, the old vampire folk tales that are still present in there that have largely been lost in modern interpretations. And
it's kind of funny how it's kind of treated like almost a little bit monster mystery style, in that like he does a really good job covering things up, but the story also wants to hint to you right away that something is wrong with him, while also making him cool enough and classy enough for you to still be kind of shocked when you find out, oh, he's not just a monster, he's the monster.
Yeah, and I mean, the original Dracula story is kind of a slow burn. And I think like the entire first part of the book is told from the perspective of like diary entries written by a guy as he's gradually discovering the truth about Dracula.
Yep, and even then Dracula disappears from the story for like another third of it after the reveal.
Yeah, at least visibly.
Story spends a lot of time just kind of meandering, not necessarily in a bad way. It's a writing style that I believe used to be more common, but you very, very rarely see nowadays, especially with bigger, more popular stories, because it's not just Jonathan Harker's journal entries. Dracula is written entirely and exclusively from the perspective of various writings of the different main characters, whether it's letters to each other, journal entries to themselves, stuff like that. Pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course this episode isn't just about Dracula, although I do, he is the vampire, so you're going to hear about him a lot. But suffice to say that between those more modern vampire takes, plus all the old myths and folk tales and things like that, it's suffice to say that vampire stories have been around for a long time. And going by the fact that last year we didn't release, but someone released Last Voyage of the Demeter, which is a Dracula story, and the fact that a couple of days ago, Abigail, which was inspired by Daughter of Dracula, also just released. They aren't going anywhere anytime soon.
And Castlevania Nocturne happened, and we have reason to believe we're going to keep getting more.
That would make sense.
Vampires aren't going anywhere.
Generations of vampires in Castlevania.
Fits very well. You can't get rid of vampires in our world, and you can't get rid of them in real life either, because
those pesky vampires.
I think what I said earlier holds true in a very literal way. As long as people still have blood, vampires are going to continue to be relevant in the cultural zeitgeist.
Yeah. I mean, they beat everything from monsters lurking in the dark to tragic anti-heroes to sexy gothic pretty boys, as I said, and everything in between. Which does sort of raise the question of, like, if we're going to really get into discussing vampire stories, where do we even begin? And, like, I have so many notes for this one. I went deep into the research, as you know, because I started messaging you about it, going, holy shit. But audience, you didn't know, and now you do.
Yeah, there's so much to just vampires in general.
Yeah, so I think maybe we can start with, like, a bit of an overview of the common elements of modern vampire stories, and see if we can sort of pinpoint roughly how these things came about, if we can. And then from there we could jump to how vampires actually fit into storytelling, because that's the important thing. Because there are a couple of, like, common trends or common attributes that you can typically find in a modern vampire. The obvious one is drinking blood, which, as far as I'm aware, like, a demonic entity drinking blood can be traced all the way back to myths about Lilith, the sort of mythological mother of demons and evil.
Yeah, man. Imagine getting branded as the ultimate demon throughout history forever just because your husband remarried while there weren't many other people around.
Yeah.
It's gotta be rough.
Yeah, so that one is an easy one, I think. Like, I think a lot of it traces back to like that sort of origin. And then, of course, there's things like leeches, vampire bats, unpleasant things that are known for drinking blood that can easily lend some inspiration. There's elements of, blood being associated with vitality in life naturally, so a lot of evil creatures in mythology prey on blood because that is, in a lot of people's eyes, especially back then, the essence of being alive.
Yeah, especially because I mean, for a lot of reasons, but it's the one thing that pretty much flows through our entire body, makes just about everything work, and it's the main thing water within our body does. So it also has that strong connection to what is externally considered the liquid of life too for the world.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
it's the closest anything physically can to being human essence.
Yeah, the pale skin seems to have been largely inspired by disease, as far as I can tell. I think it's a commonly held belief that a lot of vampire traits and things were basically borrowed from tuberculosis.
Yeah, and just about anything else that would give people an intense need for more blood, usually because they don't have enough or their blood is bad.
Yeah. The pointed teeth, I kind of have nothing for, actually. It just seems to sort of start in some of those early Penny Dreadfuls like Barney the Vampire and things like that. Probably because people sort of thought, hey, vampires should probably be like really efficient at this neck biting thing, huh?
If they're gonna bite and drink blood, they should probably have a way to bite good.
Immortality is also, of course, the other sort of major thing, and that's an interesting one because it sort of seems like it's very implicit in a lot of vampire mythology that vampire or the vampiric creatures of that mythos are immortal or at least very long-lived, and that they typically sustain this immortality by consuming the blood of other creatures, which makes sense as we've established because blood is basically in a lot of stories and mythologies represented as the physical incarnation of one's life force, their very being. So it does stand to reason that if you were surviving off of consuming the blood of your victims, you would basically be taking their life into your own and thus extending your life, which is kind of cool when you think about it and break it down like that.
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget that for a long time in a few different cultures, ritualistic cannibalism was a thing for that very reason, including as a considered honorable thing amongst the warriors of some of the cultures.
Yeah, or at the very least, a lot of cultures have had like blood sacrifice, which is tied into very similar things. One of the things I did was watch for preparation for this episode was go back and rewatch OSP's episode on Dracula, and I was reminded by that episode that there is in fact a Mayan god, I think it was Mayan, who is basically a vampire. So even it even can be viewed as giving your life to blood sacrifice can be viewed as giving your life to the divine, even for some sort of reward or as penance or as a please don't smite all of us. There's a lot to it, but it all comes back to that basic idea of blood is life, is your very vitality. Now, the other two things on my list are a little more dubious, I guess, as far as origins go still, which is that in modern interpretations, especially very modern interpretations, vampires are typically depicted as being inhumanly strong and durable, which, off the top of my head, because I don't think Dracula was particularly physically powerful. I don't think Nosferatu was really. I don't think, and he came much later, to be fair. But I don't think
Dracula
was
really
the other vampire.
strong. He was really strong, but he wasn't. If he was superhumanly strong, then it was like Captain America level superhuman strength at best, though.
That's pretty strong.
His main power his power was in just his intelligence, his planning, and he has some magic. He can do the bat thing.
Well, yeah, that's the other thing I was going to say. A lot of the time, other sort of more mystical magic power like hypnotism, shape shifting, or just straight up spellcasting are also fairly common traits that vampires have. And honestly, as best I can tell, the main reason to give vampires these abilities is just to make them powerful. It's that simple. I think the main reason is just to set them up to be the ultimate sort of predator.
Yeah, no, I think part of how vampires, like, in stories change and adapt over time. This is always true with stories over the years to a point, but I think vampires more than any others have like almost a symbiotic relationship with human history, and that much like how the real vampires would have to change and adapt as humans do, the stories of them and the way they're written do as well. They've had to become stealthier, more charismatic, more human, and in some ways more magical over time, because more so than the vast majority of other creatures of folklore, people want vampires to be believable. People want vampires to be presented and come up in a way that the ones you are seeing in stories could still exist right now and be lurking who knows where. They get better at hiding, they get better at manipulating, and they get a stronger pull within the zeitgeist, because even that is something that would help them survive.
Yeah, it's funny that like for just about any other creature, or at least definitely a majority, the more powerful you make an entity in a story, the less easy it is to suspend your belief. But to an extent, with vampires and other similar creatures, things that go bump in the night that specifically hunt humans, you have to make them quite deadly and powerful and crafty. Partially because as human societies progress, we've become more aware of things, we've become more capable, we've become more dangerous because of our technology and things like that. So, to an extent, a creature like a vampire would have to be unnaturally powerful to successfully continue to hunt humanity for hundreds of years. But also, I think some of it is the self-perception. Like we think pretty as a species tend to think pretty highly of our capabilities, and that has only gotten more and more so as our capabilities have grown. So naturally, we're going to want the creatures we write that specifically hunt us and predate on us to be vastly superior to us, to preserve our pride almost.
Well, a vampire that's not that doesn't feel supernatural and unstoppable is just a really pale serial killer.
Yeah, that is true. That's a good jumping point to start looking into. I think what like the types of vampire you get in modern storytelling, and we are going to focus primarily on modern vampires going through this. We might jump back to like old mythology every now and then, but if we did that again, with how many vampires and vampire adjacent beings there are in just European folk tales alone,
we wouldn't get very far.
We would have to do an entire new podcast just on vampire stories.
Yeah.
I've sort of broken it down, right, into, there's a couple of different general archetypes I've been able to figure out for the modern vampire. Essentially, it starts at the predatory monster. This is the one that's in a lot of ways closest to the original sort of idea of vampires in folk tales and mythology. They're the monster that stalks you in the night to drain your life away. They're, regardless of their methodology, that's the stuff you get from like Dusk Till Dawn, Salem's Lot. The vampires who exist purely to be monsters and to take your life in a fairly direct and predatory, scary way.
They must eat you.
pretty much. Like, they're usually sentient. They have a degree of intelligence, but they're not depicted as particularly witty or clever or charismatic. They are just hungry.
They are genuine creatures of the night.
Yeah. There's sort of a step up or down, depending how you want to look at it. A step away, we'll say, from that. That's what you've got your charismatic or even seductive villains. You've got that's where a lot of these original, quotation marks, original vampire figures sort of fit in. Your Dracula from Bram Stoker's work, Carmilla, the guy from Vampire. They're cunning and they're smart. They are powerful not just in who they are physically, but by virtue of their places in society, their resources, just their allure. And it is their allure and their charisma and their glamour often, that sort of supernaturally entrancing nature, that's their greatest weapon. Even if they are incredibly physically strong and durable, even if they have access to all this other magic stuff, it is so often in this sort of archetype, it is their pure raw force of existence, how hard it is to resist them and not be enthralled by them, that is their greatest weapon.
Yeah, and like connecting it to the stuff I said before, I think that is like, that was always destined to be one of the main traits of vampires, and is probably, or is very likely to be a trait of like many modern monsters that are supposed to still exist today if they hunt humans. Because like, the biggest thing about making it believable is you have to be like, okay, well, how come they still haven't been revealed and like taken out once humanity is completely taken over the planet and we are everywhere and have modern weapons that could probably still kill them even with their power? And it's like, well, because we don't find them and we don't attack them, and those of us who do find them usually don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, and it does check out, like, how many real predators in nature, rather than go actively hunting, just make themselves enticing and attract prey to them. Anglerfish are famous for it. Carnivorous plants smell delicious to insects. They come up and get snapped up. There are snake species that have like little appendages at the end of their tails that look like worms, so birds and rodents and large bugs will come to eat the worm and then get got by the snake.
True. As they say, you catch more flies with honey.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a strong basis for that sort of idea in nature, and that continues to lend to even to this idea of vampires as predators, which is cool. I like that about it. It's interesting. It's smart even when creating a monster that preys specifically on us, is to give them skill sets and abilities that make them perfect for preying on us. And one of those, and this is just the extreme of being appealing. Vampires, especially nowadays, are charismatic and alluring, and again, especially now, beautiful. Where they used to be horrifying, ugly creatures that crept in the night. These days, they're generally portrayed as sexy, hot people. Because most people, that's one of the things that we're real vulnerable to.
Sure is.
Some of us are less than others, but unless you are completely asexual, that's one of the things that can lure a person in is charisma and beauty.
Even if you're asexual, like, everybody has some concept of beauty, and very few people are not heavily enticed by whatever that is, regardless of like what that beauty is to them.
Again, it doesn't have to be physical beauty either. It can also just be raw charisma. Just being an incredible conversationalist can lure people into a false sense of security, make them vulnerable. Or
I've even
the
seen some
promise of
interesting
wealth and riches.
vampires where, like, their whole thing is that they're artists, and they entice people with their art more than anything else.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, this is, in quotation marks here, the perfect vampire. They typically still have the strength, the magic or whatever, but they have evolved to a much more practical and effective skill set for hunting the modern human, which is fun.
You got to be able to look at them and be like, wait, is that person I saw at that party a vampire? They fit all this stuff. Didn't some people go missing at that masquerade ball 20 years ago?
This wine tastes funny.
Oh no.
But
why does this tag say A? Are we grading wine by letters now?
Mine is ranked 0. Doesn't even get a letter. No, I think
that doesn't even make sense. Oh.
Yeah. Oh. Here's where things get interesting though, because from this point on in our vampire genealogy, it branches off a lot more from this sort of easy to follow straight line. And this is where things get kind of weird, right? Because a lot of these other archetypes now tend to be more tragic or even heroic. We'll start with the obvious. You have your brooding, tragic figures. Those from Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. You've got Angel from Joss Whedon's Buffyverse stuff. You have Alucard in Castlevania. I know he's only technically half vampire. It counts. And they are portrayed often as tortured by their very nature. They must hunt humans and drink their blood to survive. They are cursed to forever be the lone immortal. If they can no longer go out and embrace the sun. They become
the vampire's a one-way deal.
They become victims of circumstance instead of predators and hunters.
That's really the only two ways becoming a vampire can go, right? You can't really just you can kind of side exist with
you either love it or you hate it.
I mean, honestly though, yeah, your only two options really are to embrace it, do the thing that everybody else is doing, or don't. There's very rarely a side-like way to not embrace it, but not really do it either, because vampires are made to predate on humans. Even in stories where vampires can drink any blood, and it doesn't necessarily have to be human blood, drinking anything that's not human blood is either almost useless to them, so they need crazy amounts, which then it's not really much better than killing people, or it's just awful and terrible, and sure, they could feed on rats, but they need to feed on 20 rats for it to count as a meal, and it's disgusting and might be diseased.
Or another sort of common trend, trait version of that, I should say, is just it's surviving, but it's not living. They can do it, but they'll be a husk of what they should be. It's not a pleasant existence.
There's no winning on that one. Because the temptation is always there, the pull and the desire and obsession that's a physical part of your very being, much like blood, is there whether you like it or not, which means there generally is no option to ignore it. It never goes away. It only gets stronger, which means you can only either embrace it or actively fight it.
Yeah, and I think it's such an interesting jump, right? Because it makes a lot of sense.
What are you going to do, not eat food?
Yeah. And it still has that hunger for blood as sort of the core trait, but it's such a completely different twist on it. And I think Anne Rice was one of the first ones to really do this, and it's such an interesting twist. It would have been so subversive.
I love interviewing a vampire. Interview with a Vampire is great, and it makes me happy.
I had no idea how many of the Vampire Chronicles books there actually were, because people only ever talk about Interview with a Vampire, but like she was
It's
writing
because
them
that's the only
for,
one that got a movie for the most part. I think the one right after got a movie too, but nobody liked it.
it was like 10, 20 years worth of them. It's wild.
Like, yeah, I know. It really is the Vampire Chronicles. Like, you
Just,
don't think of it.
just to give you a hint of the staying power of vampires in fiction, really. Branching off of that again, you have another step away. You have your edgy anti-heroes, characters like Spike, again from Buffy, or Blade. Alucard, to an extent, also kind of fits in here, but effectively they are often vampires that hunt other vampires or other monsters. They are angry, they're brooding, but in a more aggressive way. They are self-destructive in a lot of ways. They're your bad boy vampire.
You can't be a good boy vampire. If you're a good boy vampire, then you're not really a vampire. You just, at that point, you have to sparkle in the sun.
Oh, we'll get to that. Yeah, these guys are very similar to the brooding or tragic vampire. You know, they are still kind of doomed by their circumstance, hated by vampire society because they kill them quite a lot, hated by the humans they've sworn to protect because they're a fucking vampire that subsists on their blood. But instead of making them sad and broody, it makes them sad and broody, but also angry and violent. So it's kind of it's more like a subcategory of the brooding tragic vampire than it is a completely distinct thing, the edgy anti-hero vampire. They're typically very 90s and very cool.
And, you know, they're tired of feeling sad and upset about what they are, so they're going to do something about it. And they can't cure themselves, so instead they're going to try to cure the world, one head of their cousins at a time.
That's really quite funny. Then, of course, you have the vampire as the object of lust. Kind of the logical extreme of really focusing in on that charismatic aspect of the modern vampire. It's very easy to see how we got here with stories like, you mentioned Twilight is the obvious one, but there's just so many vampire romance books.
Oh yeah, oh man, and then for the adults there was True Blood.
Yep, that you've got
True Blood was a time. I think I watched like the first season of that. I think True Blood is one of the only things I ever spite watched where the spite wasn't directed at the thing I was watching. I was watching it out of spite at something else. I watched True Blood because it was the only popular vampire thing at the time that was just so not Twilight.
Yeah, and it's funny. Like it's like looking at like what is it? Not like a taxonomical tree, a genealogy tree, not like a family tree, but like a evolutionary tree. You can see the ancestor with how Carmilla and Dracula functioned.
Yeah,
and
then
succubi and incubi, of course, the original seductive object of lust vampires.
And it just goes and it goes and it goes until we have the dichotomy that is True Blood and Twilight.
And honestly, especially when you factor in all of the other vampire romances, all the like schlocky ones that are just poured out. I'm sure there's plenty of good stuff in there too. I don't want to criticize authors of books I haven't read, but unfortunately, I have read Twilight, and I'll criticize that as much as I bloody want.
Do it. Criticize Twilight all day. Criticize 50 Shades of Grey. Criticize that author and everything they do.
They were given to me as gifts by someone who clearly misjudged my character, and I felt obligated to read them, so I did. And
also, I don't know why I said that author 50 Shades of Grey is not the same person, but
it was inspired by it.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's arguably the most common modern vampire is the object of lust. Then
Probably because that's the most realistic one, because fictional vampires are a very real object of lust for a lot of real people, sadly. You can't
Uh,
stop stories that are horny for vampires existing when you can't stop people from being horny for vampires.
if someone has thought of it, there is porn of it.
There's that too.
Um, but yes, then we have one of my favorite variations of the more modern vampire, and I like it because it kind of cycles back around to the more predatory nature of it, but in a very different way, where you have vampires portrayed as like powerful secret societies that have just been accumulating wealth and power and using that to their advantage over time. And
Yes, the vampire Illuminati.
yes, the vampire Illuminati, exactly. Which, that's the vampires in Underworld, which is honestly a criminally underrated series of movies.
Yeah.
It is the whole premise of the TTRPG Vampire the Masquerade, and all of its like spin-off content. And it appears in a lot of other stories. Fuck it, the main antagonist in bloody Twilight of this.
That's true.
It's interesting, and you can kind of see the origins of this in Dracula as well, since he is a rich count, lord, whatever. So that is interesting, and I'm going to get back to this one in a second, because this is a particularly interesting version of the modern vampire to me, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who's listened to anything I've written or ever had a conversation with me. But more often than not, and I think I kind of just touched on this just a second ago, even, vampire stories frequently incorporate multiple versions of the vampire. They will mix and match or combine or make use of a lot of these different archetypes, either playing them against each other or combining them to make a particularly problematic villain, or all numbers of things. Hell, Castlevania and Buffy both feature basically every single thing on that list.
True. Yeah, so what if it's only one vampire story? They're all vampires.
Alucard on his own is basically everything on that list.
Which Alucard? Because we got some fun different ones to work with. Because let's not forget, there's also the Helsing Alucard. But to be fair, that one is just Dracula.
Yeah, I'm a little bit less familiar with the various iterations of Helsing, but
there's not a whole lot of Helsing there. Alucard and Helsing is basically, what if Dracula was an eldritch horror? What if Dracula contained within him the tortured soul of every single person he'd ever fed on throughout his long, long life, and it had turned him into a monster that might as well be a walking portal to hell itself, that could do things like burst Cerberus out of his chest to eat people.
Yeah. Which is a wonderful segue to the next thing I'd like to say, which is vampire stories can be just about anything.
All you gotta have in it is monsters who drink blood or eat people and sometimes look like people.
Yeah, but basically, as long as you have a powerful, immortal humanoid that drinks blood in some way, you can make your vampire story about literally anything. Which means that vampire stories have been and can be used to explore a lot of different ideas and themes.
Yeah, including stories that have nothing to do with vampires, other than that they do in fact have a vampire in them.
Yeah. It's kind of crazy. But that's what happens when you're dealing with a concept that is one of the oldest narrative ideas in human history. It's a surprisingly deep wormhole to go down. There is a lot of different theory crafting of like why vampire stories have ended up the way they are and why certain archetypes exist, and you can sort of trace all the different inspirations, a lot of them back to Dracula, but then you can trace that back to all the things that inspired it, like Varney and like Vampire and Carmilla, and you can trace them back to the things that inspired them in sort of more modern, quotation marks, the modernized fears of the vampire and the folk tales that inspired those fears. And
I want to go back and read Varney at some point. I love the idea of a vampire having, like, I know it's not really, but to me, probably because it's so close to Barney, Varney sounds like a gentle, grew up in the middle of bumfuck nowhere hick name.
Yeah, it's not a particularly intimidating name. Although
I
say,
love having names like that attached to quote unquote monsters.
I do think that from my understanding, the Varney of those stories is definitely not as bumbling as the Varney persona used by Death in Castlevania.
Well, of course not.
But yeah, and all of this means that there can be some surprising stuff to find when you go down the vampire rabbit hole. And one of the things that I had never thought about, but when I read about it on Wikipedia and then used that as a reason to delve into a bunch of other stuff, it was like, holy shit, no, this makes a lot of sense actually, is that there could be some surprisingly political undertones and symbolism when it comes to vampire, right? Because a lot of vampire stories, a lot of the vampires, they're depicted as dark, rich loaders who live in giant, ominous castles who survive on the blood of peasants. That is literally the original Dracula's whole shtick.
Honestly, like, maybe that's the reason Batman never has to kill. Maybe murder's the only thing that stops him from just being Dracula.
You know how many, there are sidebar, there are so many Batman versus Dracula stories.
Including one of the rare Batman animated movies, literally Batman vs. Dracula.
It's wild how often that happens. But other stories like Underworld, like I mentioned, show them as these powerful secret societies with an immortal life's worth of wealth accumulated at the expense of ordinary people, and to the detriment of ordinary people, because that's how accumulated wealth works. You know, Voltaire compared the upper social classes to vampires, and even Marx, yes, that Marx, describes the accumulation of wealth by the capitalist elite in vampiric terms. So, surprisingly enough, vampires have often been used as a symbolic critique of capitalistic greed. Or
makes sense. I would call capitalistic rich dudes bloodsuckers. They just suck the blood of society instead of individual people.
That's basically what Voltaire said. He was like, you know, people seem a lot less afraid of vampires these days, but but look at this, they live among us. That's basically what he said, pointing at like bankers and shit.
I mean, good on him. Like, what's the joke, like, derogatory term for vampires? Leeches. And who are more of a leech than the rich people who feed on those beneath them to continue staying rich?
You heard it here first. Jeff Bezos is a vampire.
Jeff Bezos, I wouldn't be surprised if his whole entire goal in becoming so incredibly rich and powerful was to become a vampire, and if they're around, they just don't want him.
Yeah.
He's been trying this whole time, and no one will do it.
In a more general sense, with a little bit less of a Marxist twist, for those of you who are scared by socialism, you could also just take it as a much more generalized view of the powerful who predate on the vulnerable. But I feel like that's kind of like no shit.
Yeah, I mean, but it'll always fit because every society has got a version of that. You can call them a bunch of different things, but they are everywhere because that is, very sadly, those are intrinsic human values, so there will always be people taking them to their illogical extreme.
Yeah, I mean, Underworld goes a step further, even arguably, because historically the Underworld vampires were slavers. The whole origin of the war between werewolves and vampires, the ongoing conflict in that story, as we learn in the prequel movie, actually and to a lesser extent, I suppose, in the original one, but we learn all this, is that at first, way back when, vampires used lycanthropes as slaves. They were all spawned off like the original Immortal and the children of the werewolf version of that. They were just brought up in collars and chains as a labor force for vampire society, who took care of all the stuff that had to be done in daylight, who made their weapons and armor. And the decoy antagonist of the first Underworld movie, whose name I've just forgotten.
I don't remember either.
I'm just Googling it right now. You can probably hear the typing.
I'll always love Underworld. It's the only movie that had the balls to give me a werepire.
Where is it? It's in here somewhere. No, not Ray's. Although he is very cool. Why am I having so much trouble finding this? Oh, there it is. Lucian.
Right. I probably should have guessed that. That is a very vampire or a very werewolf name.
Yeah, like he's this sort of decoy antagonist. He's got his own thing going on. He's doing some evil shit, but ultimately all of that happened because he was a slave to vampire kind who fell in love with the vampire leader's daughter. They, had a secret illicit relationship. She got pregnant. He was locked in chains to be executed. She was to be executed. She didn't make it out, but he did, and he brought all the other werewolves with him, and ever since then there was just violence and conflict and all kinds of horrible shit. Celine, the main protagonist of the Underworld series, her whole thing at first was she is a death dealer who hunts lycans because they killed her family, but even that's not true. They didn't. That was actually Victor.
I wonder if maybe one of the biggest reasons that whole slavery thing started in the first place was partially jealousy. Werewolves can walk around in the daytime and vampires can't. Vampires have an entire, slightly more, really, than half of all time cut off from them for the most part. And werewolves, despite their other issues, don't.
Yeah.
If they were allowed to roam free, they could just kind of live. And vampires can't, even if there's nobody holding their chains.
Maybe. But yeah.
Probably mad.
So that's a lot of interesting symbolism there in the more predatory side of vampires, and has given me a whole new respect for vampires as antagonists. But that is hardly the only things that are explored, and like we've said, vampires as that kind of predator anyway, is not as common. These days they do tend to be more tragic or even heroic because they often have a darkness to them, but it's not eating people because they love eating people, generally speaking. A common one that we get these now is the focus on immortality, the isolation and loneliness being an immortal vampire brings. Because if you're immortal, any immortal story deals with this stuff, right? The idea is if you're an immortal being, you have to come to live with the fact that you're going to outlive everyone you have ever known and loved, and that effectively all of your relationships are kind of meaningless because...
Oh no.
What?
You said outlived everyone you ever loved. And now I'm just imagining the Think Mark speech, but they're both wearing crappy little plastic vampire things with little capes.
But it's that same basic premise, this idea of the only people they can really keep company with are other vampires, because what is a human life to them? Fuck their food. How can they possibly...
regardless of whether they like eating them or not, our entire life is a flash in the pan.
Yeah, how can they possibly have a genuine, equal relationship? And that can be torturous for some of them, because they just want to hang out.
Yeah, I mean, let's let's not deny, like, a human nature thing we do in real life is, I'm fairly confident that a big part of why we have animals as pets is also because almost all of them are so much more short-lived than us. Like, it's kind of hard not to think of something as at least a little bit lesser than yourself if its life is a fraction of yours.
I mean, we do. Let's be honest. Like,
Exactly.
as much as we love our pets, as a general rule, humans look at animals as lesser beings. They don't have access to the same intellect, the same range of emotion and feeling, the same complicated societies. They don't have usually the same long lives. Granted,
And it's a
there
very
are some that
common
dwarf
theme.
our lifespans, but they have all the other stuff missing, so they still count.
It's a very common thing in stories for immortals to feel the same way about people.
Yeah. They are pets or they are food, because what else could they possibly be to a vampire? And,
So much lesser in every metric that they understand.
yeah, and then of course you get kind of a spin-off of that, right? Because of course they are to us predators. They are to them, whether they like it or not. We are food. We can start dealing with prejudice when it comes to vampires, which is we're really getting into the more brooding, tragic vampire territory here, which is
Got some fun ideas for vampire prejudice.
yeah, which is just, I mean, there's a lot of that baked into Underworld, like we've talked about, but I'm talking more about the prejudice of, they're not necessarily evil. They may go out of their way not to actively hunt humans. Maybe they've got a friend at a blood bank, or they subsist as a lesser existence on animals out of some moral obligation. But by virtue of being a vampire, they must be alone because mortal kind are terrified of them and hate them.
And the vast majority of the other vampires would judge them and hate them for denying their nature.
Yeah, and this could actually lead to like a really interesting flip of it, right? Where the vampire is now the prey, not the predator. Where you've got, your sort of Helsing figures or whatever hunting vampires because they are vampires. And even though the vampire is perfectly capable of defending themselves, they won't because of their moral code or whatever it is that stops them wanting.
If the only power you have is that of a monster, how do you use it without being a monster?
Exactly. And that's actually kind of cool when you think about it, right? Like, I feel like I've been kind of tongue-in-cheek and poking a lot of fun at the idea of the brooding, loner, sexy vampire, but conceptually, there's a lot of really cool stuff there, and honestly, I've enjoyed a lot of vampire media that makes good use of this sort of archetype. And this is why. Because who doesn't love a tortured, tragic hero?
Yeah, we do it all the time without vampires. Why would it suddenly be bad when it does have vampires?
Yeah, and I mean, vampirism can also be very symbolic of like disease, which can play into that in some ways and stuff like that as well, where they are, you don't want to be a vampire, but you get bitten, you catch the disease. I mean, a lot of times vampirism in media is caused by a virus these days, or a venom or whatever, and it morphs you into something you're not, and your life becomes suffering as a result because now you've got this hunger that you all the time that you have to deal with. You can't go out in the sun. It's just another sort of spin-off of that sort of same category of the more tragic vampires. But it's an allegory that's there, and I think that can be traced all the way back to the tuberculosis thing.
One of the aspects I always have fun seeing that very few stories outright tell you, but there are a lot of stories who will show you, is a popular side effect of vampirism that is, again, rarely explicitly said, but is very frequently still there. A side effect is increased will to live. Your will to live is literally an aspect of being a vampire, as evidenced by tons of tortured soul type vampires who act like they would prefer to just die. and yet they can't seem to do something like just walk into the sun and let it all in.
Not unless, their wildly inappropriate girlfriend leaves them for a werewolf and they need to take their sparkly ass into the Italian sunlight.
Yeah, or if something genuinely pushes them to have a moment where they decide to let it all end. But if they are just sitting there living, almost none of them ever can just choose to die, even if it sounds like that's what they want.
Yeah, I mean, the hunger is a very common aspect of vampire stories. It's like this borderline uncontrollable urge to hunt and prey and consume blood. A lot of the time, trying to reject that hunger and not hunt is hell for the vampire. It's almost like going through withdrawal. So
yeah, it's like starving to death and going through the most intense withdrawals ever at the same time, while also not being able to die from it.
Yeah, so just as an addict who is going through withdrawal might cave and go back to the drug just to make the suffering end, a vampire might cave in and eat their neighbor because they just need the suffering to stop, and they will hate themselves for it. And that's where you get another thematic thing: vampires as drug addicts.
That's true.
Which is another interesting one. But of course, the most common themes these days in vampire stories, as we've said, are themes relating to romance and sex. Especially the sort of darker tropes in that domain. Stuff like forbidden love, complicated and unhealthy power dynamics, abuse, obsession, predatory behavior, just unhealthy relationships in general.
Yeah, it's hard for vampires to have healthy relationships.
Yeah, I mean, of course, loving a thing that is, by virtue of what they are, predisposed to eat you is dangerous, so that is naturally forbidden. By the same token, even if it is a genuine, actual love between the vampire and the human, there is such a massive imbalance in power because one is immortal, borderline indestructible, and again, biologically compelled to predate on humanity, and one is a human. So that's already kind of like, that's bit ominous, bit dark, kind of weird when you look into it. It gets even weirder when if you're doing vampires specifically as undead beings. But then, of course, because of that allure, the glamour, the hypnotic nature some vampires have, they can, when you put them in a romance story, those things can become very easily an allegory for a predatory, abusive relationship, or just one which is kind of toxic.
Yeah, it's very hard to have a relationship with an intense imbalance of power, and vampires have a very intense, natural, and unavoidable imbalance of power when paired up with humans.
Yeah, and you look at it and you're like, it's so hard to see these things ever really ending well.
That's one of the reasons I love Lisa and Dracula in Castlevania. Part of why that works is there's not an imbalance of power. Physically, sure, but she walked right into his castle and was like, hey, make me a doctor.
Yeah. He's like, what?
I eat people, you know. She's like, yeah, and I want to save people, and you know science and stuff.
What of it? They work because Lisa isn't, whilst not physically powerful, she has a very strong mind and force of personality, and she went in
a singular force of will.
Yeah, and she basically went in there and made Dracula her bitch.
Yeah.
Which you gotta love Lisa Tempest, but even that ends tragically. And that was a surprisingly healthy relationship. Vampires, humans, don't bone each other. It's not a good idea, for our vampire listeners out there. And, the thing is, even vampire stories that don't intentionally do this as, to showcase the unhealthy nature of the relationship, or as, some sort of metaphor for a predatory relationship or whatever, even the ones that don't intend to do this often still do it.
Because it's always there.
Because it's just inherently baked in to the fact that a vampire is a vampire and a person is a person. If you do this, no matter how you fetishize it or whatever, it's unavoidable by nature because a vampire is a being that exists to predate on humans. And I mean, how often do humans who fall in love with vampires eventually get turned and effectively become someone different as a result? It's kind of
I can't remember the exact example in my head, but that was actually one of my favorite explorations of the dynamic I ever saw. Was one where like human and a vampire together for a really long time, and then finally it's like, okay, well, I don't want to keep getting older. I want us to be together forever. Turn me. Person gets turned, quickly changes into something they weren't before, and not the person that the vampire themselves fell in love with.
yeah. I mean, it's the logical conclusion, right? Either the human's gonna die, either the vampire's gonna have a bad hunger day and consume them, or they're just gonna die of old age or injury or sickness or something. So of course, a vampire who's deeply in love with this mortal being is gonna make them immortal, and by virtue of doing that, they've created another predatory being, not dissimilar to how a lot of the time an abuser has historically been abused themselves. Unsurprisingly,
On that very savory note, I am out of time.
Yeah, I was saying, unsurprisingly, shit gets real dark in vampire stories, but we can, in fact, leave that one there. We've gone over a lot of stuff. We've covered a lot of the interesting stuff, and I'm looking forward to getting into some more specific examples in the coming episodes. I have very strong suspicions. I know what one of them is going to be on account of I know you.
Maybe. I've got a couple different ideas.
I'm juggling between two. But yeah, for now, if you guys are listening to this over on Spotify, you can also find these episodes on my website, radfordwrites.com. I also post the stories I write for these episodes there. I put some other writing there too. I do blog and articles. I do blogging and articles there as well, I should say, mostly focused on writing stuff. You could also find links to buy my books, and you can also find episodes of these podcasts slowly catching up on YouTube as the sort of backlog becomes smaller and smaller, and eventually that will catch up. And you can find John on Twitch and YouTube as Sephir, Sephear, producing that sweet, sweet gaming content. For now, we'll see you until next time. Don't get bitten by some sort of horrible immoral predator in the meantime.
And definitely don't bang one.